All right, children, it's time for the Western separation talk. I put a lot of thought into this one before I made it, so uh, I take pride in being a Canadian. Well, I did until I figured out that apparently the real Canadians don't think us Western Canadians are very Canadian. And if they do, we're their embarrassing cousins who may as well go be stateside along Alabama. Yeah, fuck off. Now, I took a lot of time to think about whether I was more proud to be a Canadian or more proud to be an Albertan. And unfortunately, you know what? It's the latter. Because numbers don't lie. And frankly, politicians do. Now, I'd like to go back to two memes that I saw. One of them was an image from, I think it was 1935, and it shows a cow in pretty much across the map of Canada. And Western Canada is on the pitchforks sweating their asses off to feed the cow while the money men out east milk it. And it's still relevant today. You know, in the time Alberta's been in the Canadian Federation, we've paid out $200 billion in equalization and gotten nothing. And it's a sham. And our taxes keep going up. And I mean, we have a lot to cover here in this one. So bear with me because my brain is going to go to a lot of different places on this. But essentially, I think it's time for Western separation. BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Pretty much everything west of the Canadian Shield. Now, I'm sure you know what that is if you grew up in a time where elementary schools taught something other than self-loathing for what happened to the natives, and that's a different video altogether. So, yeah, Western separation. Now, the second meme that I saw started off with something along the lines of the year is 2035, the monetary denomination of the Republic of Western Canada, the Klein, is worth about 4 cents Canadian, which, I mean, frankly, as it stands, is worth like 68 cents American. So that's gone down from $1 American in 5 years pretty fast. Anyway, that second meme, that's pretty much what I'm going to argue against here. Western Canada has economically carried Canada for the last 5 decades. Even more so after auto manufacturing in Ontario got outsourced to Mexico and China. Quebec's never really had an economy. They are a welfare province, essentially. However, it's not like they're without their importance. You know, the French people of Quebec are very stalwart and adamant in the preservation of their culture, their heritage, their social status quo. Like there is much to be admired about them. Don't take me the wrong way. I'm not just going to rip on them and not point out the good. Because there is much good to be found in Quebec and its people. Unfortunately, economically, there's little to be found there. And Canada as a whole kind of relies on Quebec as sort of the Sid Meier's Civilization equivalent of having that city in the game that produces culture. But I do have to point out and admire that when Canada was being subjected to speech laws and M103, Quebec turned around and said, fine, we'll just ban everything. There's a lot to be found in their attitude of either everybody gets it or nobody gets it. And to that, good on you, Quebec. Truly, good on you. However, Quebec is easily replaced. If Western Canada is separated, you could always use Vancouver as its cultural hub. It's a coastal city. 4 point something million people. Like, when I left my hometown, I moved to Vancouver. Holy fuck, was that a crazy 2 years? I mean, I wouldn't want to go back there and live there. I certainly wouldn't, but I made some incredibly good friends out there. The people out there are wonderful. There's tons of culture to it. And that is to Western Canada what Quebec is to, well, Ontario pretty much. So if Western Canada separates, it's not like we don't have that cultural hub. And BC is beautiful anyway. I mean, if anything, it's less developed than Quebec is. And they're not dumping, 500,000 liters of liquid shit into their rivers. Just throwing that out there. So, I mean, you kind of got the culture sorted out. Now, going into the other part of this meme that was total bullshit, was like, oh, the Klein will be worth 4 cents Canadian? Bitch, please. Western Canada isn't reliant on a digital economy the way Ontario is. Like, that's the bottom line, man. Western Canada's equalization payments have been carrying Quebec forever, paying for the people out in the Maritimes because, the weather out there is absolute shit 6 months of the year. It's been paying their pogey. And ever since auto manufacturing got outsourced out of Ontario, Ontario is not exactly a have province with, the highest debt ever. So don't give me the line that Western Canada wouldn't be economically sufficient to prosper. If anything, we would do it 5 times faster with better social services, better education, better healthcare, better funded everything by not having to pick up the bill for the rest of the country. Now, another thing was like, oh, well, they're pretty much the 51st state of America because they don't have a military. This might shock the hell out of some people, but half of the Canadian Armed Forces training facilities are in Western Canada, and the other half of them are in Eastern Canada, and the people that go to both live accordingly. Now, the reason I'm pointing out the people in the armed forces and where they live is because if that's where they live and reside, they would be partaking in the referendum vote to split. And if they're willing to do the same jobs while there's a change in management, technically the Western Canadian Republic, which I don't think would work, I'll get to that later, we would have trained soldiers here. I mean, police forces in cities are largely funded by municipal governments anyway, and if Alberta's not losing $10 billion a year paying into equalization, that's $10 billion a year to fund police services and border security. And I mean, given that between Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and BC, forestry, oil, uranium, and farming. There you go. There's powerhouse economies of each of those provinces. That's huge industry. Now, if we can produce that much out of resources, yeah, giving the states a deal on it and saying you still want to cover our airspace from nukes would be pretty well worth it. Now, as far as invading forces goes, well, all you would have to do is write a constitution that allows people to legally protect themselves and bear arms. Because, I mean, a militia is more effective than a military anyway. Like, you would want a militia in a developing nation. Once it's developed and secure, that's when you get a military, because reaction time, like, a militia is already there, ready to go. Waiting for military or police intervention, there's a time frame there. So you can't pull the line that the Western Canadian emerging state or nation wouldn't be able to defend itself. It's all in how you want to constitute the law of the land, which would have to be written. So, just mull on that for a bit. And now that I've mentioned the resources of it, I mean, come on. Forestry in BC, oil in Alberta, Saskatchewan is very uranium rich, and Manitoba is full of hardy farmers and farming. That to me does not sound like a disadvantaged economy of a nation by any means. Now, keep in mind that if we decide we're going to leave, that also means the infrastructure kind of goes with us and stays with us. And what the Canadian government wants to shut off in digital access and say, okay, you don't get this anymore? Well, again, we can always just barter a deal and use someone else's satellites. So, economically, culturally, in terms of resource, the amount of resources we have, we would be really, really hard-pressed to actually have the population for it. That's an area where, yeah, there's a little bit of an issue there. However, you know how you can address that? Very simply. Because now we have to get into talking about system of governments. Now, people are saying the republic? No. There hasn't been a republic in history that's endured. So, kind of like when the founding fathers found America and said, look, this is what we know from back home. We have to come up with something new. They did it. It was revolutionary. It was significant. It mattered. How would we be able to duplicate that effort? How would anybody be able to duplicate the effort of building a nation state in a world where the corrupt powers that be are gradually trying to push towards globalism? You have to address globalism, but you also have to address a nation's right to exist if that's what its people truly want. And we were given the answer long ago. In fact, I have to take a moment here and give a huge shout out to Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, because this idea came largely from content of his. Although that just gave me a little bit more context to put to something that I'd read. Robert Heinlein, the author of Starship Troopers, and I know just as soon as I said that, you all thought about the fucking movie. And I have to implore you, don't. Because it was not a good representation in the movie of what the themes, tones, and point of the book was. And the reason I'm saying Heinlein specifically was because in the book, in Starship Troopers, a globalized society had already been established. Like, Johnny Rico in the movie was Juan Rico. He was from Buenos Aires. That's not America. That's not American. Like, the Federation in Starship Troopers was a globalist organization. However, independent, well, actually, no, not independent, but we would have to apply this principle to a smaller scale. But this is what globalism would be pushing to anyway, just without the individual nation states, which is why they pushed so hard for open borders. If you apply Heinlein's principle of having a federated government where people can work, people pay taxes, They're rendered equal social care, equal social services, equal opportunity. However, the catch to it was that you were not a citizen of the Federation. You were looked after by the Federation. You could work, you could pay taxes, you could render social services, you could draw a pension, you could get welfare in times of need. However, the people who were allowed to vote in Heinlein's Federation were only people who served a term of service in the employment of the Federation. Now, for the high-skilled people in Starship Troopers, doctors, they were given that simply by being doctors because that is a government job. So the doctors and Starship Troopers had the vote. Engineers had a vote. Anybody who at some time had done a term of service for the Federation, or, you know what, for the sake of this, I'm going to say anybody who had done service for the greater good had a say in its governance and future. But everybody else who didn't want to do that was still free to say what they wanted, criticize the Federation, go work privately. They were free to pay their taxes and enjoy all their social benefits, but they weren't allowed to vote. Because for an ideology to endure, the traditions of it have to be adhered to. In Starship Troopers, even through the constant state of war, the Federation stayed strong because the people who had a say in it were the people who served it, had a vested interest, and did their time. The other people might not have had a say, but they were never asked to put their lives on the line either. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not I suppose I am advocating for it. I'm not saying this is the way we have to go. I'm throwing an idea out there that's simply an alternative to the failing democracy that we're living through. And at least it's more than most people out there are saying when they just say, we need to separate. Because separation from the Confederation, that's not the idea. How we would do it after we achieve it, that's where the discussion needs to happen. That's my 2 bits on it. The bastard saint is preached.